The case smelled of rosin and rain the night she carried it out of the lawyer's office, and she did not yet know it was worth more than the concert hall itself. 3 weeks earlier, her grandfather had been alive, humming Brahms off-key in his hospital bed. Now she stood on Park Avenue, with nothing but a cracked violin case, and a cousin's laughter still ringing in her ears. What she would find inside that case, months later, under a luthier's steady hands, would make every one of them regret the words they'd said in that room. Rain that day, not the gentle kind, the kind that came sideways off the avenue and soaked through wool coats before the doorman could get the umbrellas up. Inside the law office, the air was dry and overconditioned, smelling of leather chairs and old paper, and she remembered thinking it was strange that a man who had spent his whole life filling concert halls with sound should be reduced to this, a manila folder, a mahogany table, 12 people arranged by bloodline and greed. She had practiced with him every evening for 11 years, Tuesdays and Thursdays in his study on West 67th Street, the metronome ticking against the hiss of the radiator, his hand steadying her bow arm long after arthritis had stiffened his own fingers. Her cousins had visited on holidays, when there were cameras or inheritances to discuss. They called his violin lessons sweet, the way one might call a child's finger painting sweet, indulgent, forgettable, beneath serious consideration. Now, in the present, in a cramped one-bedroom in Sunnyside with a radiator that never worked and a landlord who did not care about sentiment, she set the cracked case on her kitchen table and stared at it, the way one stares at a door that might or might not open. 6 months had passed since the reading, 6 months of temp work and unreturned calls, of watching her cousins post photographs from the hall's marble lobby, their hall now, their building, their name on the deed, captioned with words like legacy and honored to continue. She had not been invited to the reopening gala. She had not asked to be. The case itself was nothing remarkable to look at. Black leather gone gray at the corners, a brass latch tarnished green, a lining that had split somewhere over the decades and never been repaired. Her grandfather had carried it to every performance of his life and never once complained that it was old. She ran her thumb along the seam where the velvet lining had pulled loose from the wood, the way she had 100 times before without noticing. Tonight, for reasons she could not name, grief or stubbornness or the simple ache of missing him, she noticed. Something inside made a sound that wasn't wood, a sound that wasn't wood. She sat very still, the way she used to sit when she was 7 years old and he would tell her to listen, really listen, for the difference between an A string tuned true and one that only sounded true. He had a way of testing her patience before he taught her anything. You cannot rush an instrument into telling you the truth, he used to say, setting the bow down as if it were something sacred. You wait, it speaks when it's ready. She pressed her thumb against the seam again. There it was, a faint give, a hollow click, something shifting behind the wood that had no business shifting at all. 31 years earlier, in a rehearsal room 3 floors above the hall's box office, a much younger version of that same man had knelt on the floor with a screwdriver and a strip of black velvet, working alone after the musicians had gone home. The door was locked, the window shades were drawn, though it was already dark outside. October, the kind of damp Manhattan cold that got into the joints of old buildings and old men alike. He had told no one what he was building into the base of that case, not his accountant, not his lawyer, certainly not his son, who had already begun asking pointed questions about the hall's receipts with the particular interest of a man counting someone else's money. He worked with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years learning that the important things are rarely announced. When he finished, he ran his hand over the seam until it disappeared entirely, indistinguishable from the case's natural wear. Then he sat back on his heels and allowed himself, for just a moment, something close to satisfaction. In the present, in a kitchen in Queens with peeling linoleum and a radiator that clanked twice an hour whether or not there was heat behind it, his granddaughter dug her fingernail into the same seam and felt something give further. She stopped herself, Not tonight. Not alone. Not with a butter knife. Not out of impatience. She had learned that from him too, hadn't she? The difference between wanting something to be true and doing the careful work of finding out. She wrapped the case in the dish towel she kept by the sink, set it gently in the canvas bag she used for groceries, and did not sleep. By 7 the next morning, she was standing outside a narrow storefront on West 54th Street with a hand-lettered sign in the window. Instrument repair, since 1961. Waiting for a man she had called 3 times and left 3 messages for, a luthier her grandfather had used decades earlier, back when the hall still had a house violin and a budget for its upkeep. She did not know if he would remember the name. She did not know if he was even still alive. She only knew that whatever was inside that case had waited this long already, and she was not going to be the one who broke it open carelessly, after everything it had survived to reach her. The door did not open, not yet. A hand-lettered sign hung behind glass fogged with the breath of the city's early cold, and she stood there with the canvas bag pressed to her chest like something that might bruise. 39 years earlier, on a Tuesday in October that no one alive now remembered as anything but ordinary, a man in his 50s had walked into a different shop, the same trade, a different decade, and paid cash for a violin case lined in blue velvet, the kind with a false sense of permanence to it, brass latches that clicked like a held breath. He had told the shopkeeper it was for his granddaughter, though she had not yet been born. He had told no one else. That was the part Charlotte did not know yet, standing on West 54th Street with her knuckles going white around the handle of a grocery bag. She remembered him differently. She remembered him at 78, in the practice room above the hall's east stairwell, correcting the angle of her bow arm with 2 fingers, and no words at all, the way he corrected everything, by adjustment, not instruction. She remembered the particular smell of rosin dust in that room, and the radiator that clanked twice before it caught, and how he would sit in the folding chair by the window with his eyes closed, not asleep, just listening, the way other men his age watch television. She had thought, at 9, at 14, at 26, that this was simply what love from him looked like, attention with no explanation attached. She had not thought, not once, that attention might also be arithmetic. A light came on behind the glass. A shape moved, stooped, unhurried, a man old enough that his hands shook faintly even before he'd touched anything, and the door swung inward on a bell that had likely announced customers since before her mother was born. "You're the one who called," he said. Not a question. He had her grandfather's habit of never wasting a syllable. She held the case out before he'd finished stepping back to let her in, as if delaying the handoff even a second longer might cost her something. He took it the way she imagined a doctor takes a fragile, elderly patient's wrist, gently, but without ceremony, already assessing. "Bellwether," he said, reading nothing, because there was nothing written on it, only remembering. "Haven't heard that name spoken in this shop in—" He stopped, recalculated. "Long enough that I'm surprised I still can." He carried it to the workbench under the window without asking her to follow, and she followed anyway, the way she had followed her grandfather up those same kind of narrow stairs 100 times, learning without being told that the real work was always done slowly, under good light, by someone who refused to be rushed, and that whatever this case was still keeping from her, it would not give it up to a woman standing in a doorway. It would only give it up here. The workbench light was the kind that made every surface confess. He set the case flat beneath it, unlatched the clasps with 2 motions, so economical they seemed almost bored, and lifted the lid the way one lifts the lid of something that has already disappointed him twice before. Dust rose in a thin gray thread and hung there, undecided. 1961 Gagliano copy, French workshop, not the original, he murmured, more to the wood than to her. Case is older than the violin, which is unusual. Someone built this case for a different instrument first. She did not know what to do with that sentence, so she let it sit, the way she'd learned to let her grandfather's silences sit, trusting they would resolve themselves if she didn't crowd them. He ran a thumb along the interior lining, faded plum velvet, worn to the backing in the shape of a bow's daily rest, and frowned at a seam that did not match the others. Not a repair, a deviation. "This lining's been replaced," he said. "Once, maybe twice, not by a shop, by hand." 39 years compressed themselves into that single observation, though neither of them knew it yet. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb, its hazard lights blinking red against the shop window in a slow, patient rhythm, and she found herself matching her breath to it without meaning to. In, out, because it was easier than sitting with the small, stubborn hope rising in her chest, the hope she had spent 3 weeks telling herself she had no right to. She had not slept well since the reading. She had rehearsed the cousin's sentence in the dark so many times it had worn a groove into her. At least you get to keep making noise until even her own resentment felt tired of itself, a record needled down to static. She had told herself she was bringing the case here only for repair, only because it was the last thing of his hands had touched, only because some part of her still could not bear to sell what he'd carried up those stairs 1,000 times before her. She had not let herself think beyond that. She had trained herself, these 3 weeks, not to. The luthier lifted his glasses, set them on his forehead, and leaned close enough that she could smell rosin and old glue and, faintly, cedar. "I'm going to need to take this apart properly," he said. "Not patch it, open it. How long? A week, maybe less, if I don't find what I think I'm going to find." He said it plainly, without drama, the way her grandfather used to announce a tuning was off by a hair before anyone else could hear it, a man simply reporting what his hands already knew, before his mouth caught up. She wanted to ask him what that meant. She wanted to ask him to say it now, plainly, standing under the good light where nothing could hide. Instead, she nodded, thanked him, and left the case in his hands the way she had once left her grandfather at hospital doors, trusting the work to people who refused to be rushed, and hating, every time, how long trust asked her to wait. The subway ride back to Queens took 40 minutes, and she spent all of them not looking at her phone, which had become its own kind of discipline. Her cousin had texted twice since the reading, not to ask how she was, but to ask, with the breezy cruelty of someone who assumed forgiveness was owed simply for being related, whether she wanted the old sheet music and stuff, before we clear out the office. She had not answered. She told herself it was because she was tired. She knew, underneath that, it was because she did not trust her own voice yet to stay level. 22 years earlier, on a Tuesday in October cold enough that her breath had fogged the glass of the hall's side door, she had sat on the same narrow step outside her grandfather's office while he argued, quietly but without yielding, with a man from the bank about a loan extension. She had been 8. She had not understood the words, only the tone, the particular stillness he adopted when someone was trying to make him feel smaller than he was. He had come out afterward, taken her hand, and said nothing about it. He had simply walked her to the piano in the empty hall and let her press one key, over and over, until the sound stopped feeling like an accusation and started feeling like company. She thought of that now, standing at her kitchen counter with a cup of tea gone cold, because the luthier's voice, plain, unhurried, certain of what his hands already knew, had sounded exactly like her grandfather's had that day. Men who did not need to raise their voices to be believed. The week without the case felt longer than the 3 weeks that had preceded it. She noticed the absence of it on the shelf by her door, where she had set it each night out of habit, though there was nothing left to protect. She went to work at the restoration studio in Long Island City, re-gluing a chipped harpsichord lid for a client who would never know what her hands had been doing to hold themselves steady. She paid her rent 4 days late, and did not tell her landlord why, only apologized, the way she had apologized her whole life, for taking up space that other people insisted, in small ways, she hadn't earned. On the 5th day, the luthier called. She recognized the number before she answered, and something in her chest moved before she let herself name it as hope. "I found something," he said. "Not I think. Not. Maybe. You should come in person. Bring nothing. Just yourself. She stood in her small kitchen with the phone against her ear, the tea long since gone cold in her hand, and for the first time in 3 weeks she let herself think beyond the moment she was standing in. The subway ran late that morning, the way it always did when the minutes mattered most, and she stood on the platform on Steinway Street counting the tiles beneath her feet the way she used to count measures in a difficult passage, 4 to a phrase, breathe on the 5th. 39 years ago, though she did not know that number yet, her grandfather had stood on a different platform, on a different morning, holding a violin case that was not yet cracked, thinking of a granddaughter who had not yet been born. She did not know this either. She only knew that the train doors opened and closed twice before she managed to move through them, her body arriving before her mind consented to follow. He had taught her, once, that anticipation was the enemy of good tone. You cannot rush toward the note, he'd said, his hands steady over hers on the fingerboard, the smell of rosin and coffee thick in the small room above the concert hall. You arrive at it. Otherwise, you are not playing music. You are only waiting for it to be over. She had been 9. She had not understood him then. She understood him now, on the platform, in the car, walking the 4 blocks from the station with her coat unbuttoned in the cold because she had forgotten, entirely, that there was cold. The shop's bell above the door had a particular pitch, a worn brass note gone slightly flat with age, and she heard it the way she heard everything that week, too loudly, as if her ears had been sanded raw. The luthier looked up from his bench. He did not smile, not exactly, but something in his face had rearranged itself since she had seen it last, some private calculation finished and filed away. Sit, he said, and she did, though there was a chair 3 feet closer that she did not choose, some old instinct keeping her upright and near the door, as though whatever waited for her might yet require her to run. He set the case on the felted table between them. The lining had been peeled back in one long curling strip, the way old wallpaper comes away from plaster, and beneath it, she saw before he spoke, before he explained anything at all, there was a second surface, a false floor, a seam that did not belong to any case built for holding an instrument and nothing else. It isn't a repair job, the luthier said slowly, choosing each word the way he chose each tool. It's a compartment. Someone built it in, on purpose, a long time ago. She did not move. She did not breathe, not in any way she could later describe, only that she noticed, distantly, that she had stopped. The workshop smelled of rosin and machine oil, of sawdust that never quite settled, and under it all, faintly, the ghost of the cedar lining that had lain against that violin for 4 decades. She stared at the seam. It ran the length of the case's belly, thin as a hairline fracture, invisible unless you already knew to look, and he had known, because he had spent 30 years learning what wood does when it is asked to hide something. 40 years earlier, a man in a gray wool coat had sat in this same kind of workshop, a different one, on a different street, long since converted into a nail salon, and asked a young craftsman a question he never repeated to anyone else. She would not learn the specifics of that conversation for many more scenes to come, but something in the seam's precision told her it had not been a casual request. "Open it," she said. The luthier did not open it right away. He turned it once under the lamp, the way he had turned the whole case an hour earlier, cataloging its wounds. "Whoever did this," he said, "wasn't careless. Look at the grain match. He steamed the veneer to bend around the corner joints instead of cutting it. That takes patience most people don't have anymore." He glanced up at her, briefly, the way a man checks a second time that a door is locked. "It takes patience like yours." She thought of her grandfather's hands, spotted and steady, guiding her bow arm on winter evenings, while radiators ticked in the old apartment on 61st Street. She thought of him bent over his roll-top desk in the hall's back office, the one her cousins had already gutted for a conference room, papers spread before him that he always folded away before she came close enough to read them. She had thought, at the time, that he was only doing accounts. The luthier worked a thin blade beneath the seam, the lining lifted with a small dry sound, like a page turning in an empty room. Beneath it lay a shallow recess no deeper than a hand's width, lined in the same aged cedar, and inside it, she leaned forward without meaning to, an envelope, yellowed at the corners, and beneath that, something rectangular and stiff, bound in a thin rubber band gone brittle with age. "There's writing on the envelope," the luthier said, turning it toward the light rather than handing it to her, as though some instinct told him it should be revealed slowly, in order, the way he had revealed everything else that morning. She read her own name in her grandfather's hand, the same slanted script that used to mark her sheet music with fingerings and small encouragements in the margins. "For C, when she is ready." Nothing else, no date, no explanation. She realized she was holding the edge of the table. "Do you want a moment?" the luthier asked, not really a question, already rising, already reaching for his coat. "Before you open it?" She did not answer right away. The bell above the shop door was still swinging faintly from his exit, a small brass tremor against the glass, and for a moment the workshop held only the smell of rosin and old wood and the specific silence of a room built for listening. She turned the envelope over once, twice, the way she used to turn over exam results before she let herself read the grade. "For C, when she is ready." He had never called her Charlotte in writing, always the letter, a private shorthand, the kind you save for someone you expect to outlive you. 9 years old, and he is teaching her to tune by ear in the hall's empty balcony, the seats below draped in dust sheets like sleeping guests. "Middle C," he says, striking the piano key once, letting it ring out into the dark house. "Now find it on the string. Don't look at me. Listen." She gets it wrong 4 times. On the 5th, something in her chest goes quiet and correct at once, and he says nothing, only nods, which from him is a standing ovation. She had not thought of that balcony in years. She thought of it now, standing in a stranger's workshop in Queens, with her name in a dead man's handwriting between her fingers. She broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet, and beneath it, when she drew it free, the rectangular object the luthier had set aside, a passbook, its cover cracked along the spine, the bank's name embossed in a typeface no longer printed anywhere. She did not open it yet. She unfolded the letter first, because some order of things still mattered, because he had taught her that too. You tune before you play. You always tune before you play. "My dear girl," it began, and her eyes blurred before she reached the second line, and she had to set it down on the workbench and press the heel of her hand against her mouth until the shop stopped tilting. Across town, in an office with a river view and a coffee machine that hissed on command, a cousin was signing a lease amendment for the concert hall's ground floor, converting the old rehearsal rooms into event space for corporate mixers. He did not know yet what the word meant, buried 3 clauses deep in a trust document he had never bothered to read in full, filed decades ago under a name he had stopped thinking about the week of the funeral. He initialed the page without looking up. Somewhere south of the bridge, a woman he had once called decorative was reading, in her grandfather's hand, the first sentence of an explanation 40 years in the making. The letter did not begin with an apology, though she had braced for one. It began with a date. October the 14th, 39 years ago, a Tuesday, raining, the kind of rain that keeps subscribers home and empties a house of 800 seats down to 11. She remembered nothing of that night, of course. She had not yet been born, but she recognized the voice instantly, the way he always anchored a story in weather and numbers before he let it become sentiment. 11 people. The letter said, "And I would not cancel. I never canceled. That was the year I understood what the hall was for." She set it down again, not because it hurt this time, but because she needed both hands to open the passbook. 39 years ago, in a bank 3 blocks from the hall, a man in a gray overcoat had signed his name at a teller's window and requested that no statements be mailed to his home address. The teller, young then, long retired now, had asked if he wanted a joint account, a beneficiary form, anything ordinary. He had said no. He had said, "Just the one name, and I'll manage the rest myself," and had walked back out into weather the passbook itself would later describe in a column of deposits, irregular at first, then disciplined, then, for the last 2 decades, arriving on the same day every month like a held note. In the present, in the shop that smelled of hide glue and cedar shavings, she turned the passbook to its final entry and did not, for a long moment, understand the number. She read it the way one reads an unfamiliar language, syllable by syllable, until the shape of it resolved. Then she read it again to be sure the shape hadn't changed. It hadn't. Across the river, a cousin finished the lease amendment, capped his pen, and asked his assistant to pull the corporate mixer calendar for the spring season, already composing in his head the press line about reimagining a legacy space for a new generation. He believed, with the specific confidence of a man who has never once doubted himself, that the hall's future belonged entirely to people who understood value. He would have said, if asked, that value meant square footage, foot traffic, naming rights. He had never once asked what his grandfather meant by it. In the shop, the luthier watched her without speaking, the way one watches someone receive news at a hospital, present, useful, silent. She did not cry. She had done that already, upstairs in the letter's second line. What she felt now was quieter and stranger, something closer to recognition than joy, the sense of a door she had walked past for 39 years finally being pointed out to her, unlocked the entire time. She turned back to the letter. There was more of it. He had never, in life, said everything in one sitting, and death, it seemed, had not changed the habit. The letter's second page was written in a steadier hand than the first, as if he had rested between them, or reconsidered something, or simply grown calmer the longer he spoke to her across the distance of his own death. "You will want proof," it read. "You were always the one who wanted proof. Even as a child, you would not believe the E string was in tune until you heard it against the piano twice." She laughed once, briefly, a sound that surprised her more than it did the luthier, who kept his eyes on the workbench out of a courtesy she would not forget. "The passbook will tell you what the letter cannot make you feel." The page continued. "Numbers are honest in a way people are not. Read them slowly. They took 40 years to say what I am only now saying in an afternoon." She set the letter down and picked up the passbook again, this time letting herself actually look at it, at the long column of entries in a teller's careful hand, decades of small deposits made on a schedule too regular to be anything but deliberate. The third Friday of nearly every month, going back to a year she had not yet been old enough to hold a violin correctly. $50, then 70, then, later, when the hall's matinees sold better, more, never withdrawn, never touched, compounding in the dark the way certain kinds of love do, unannounced, unthanked, patient, past all reasonable expectation. Across the river, unaware, the cousin was telling his assistant that the hall's name would need freshening, that the legacy was a word investors liked to hear but never wanted to actually pay for. He did not know yet that the building he was standing in owed its continued use, contractually, to an option clause buried in an instrument he had never been shown, because no one, not the estate attorney, not the accountant, not even, perhaps, the man who had written it, had thought to connect the trust to the lease at the time of the reading. It had been filed the ordinary way, in the ordinary place, indistinguishable from 100 other quiet accounts, waiting. In the shop, the luthier finally spoke. "There's a bank on Lexington that still handles passbooks like this," he said. "They'll want to see the original certificate, and probably a death certificate, and you, in person." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, but there was something almost paternal in the care of it, an old man making sure a young woman did not walk into a marble lobby unprepared to be taken seriously. She nodded, folded the letter along its old creases, and looked once more at the case, split, patched, ordinary to any eye but hers, before closing it gently, as though it might still be listening. The Lexington branch, when she found it 2 mornings later, still kept its brass fittings polished, the way banks used to polish them when a bank was a place you dressed for. She had worn her one good coat, the wool one from her grandfather's last winter, and she stood in the lobby with the passbook inside a manila envelope pressed flat against her chest, like something that might otherwise be taken from her by the air itself. 40 years earlier, in a much smaller branch on the same avenue, before renovation and marble had smoothed away its character, a man in a gray overcoat had opened an account with $400 and a folded newspaper clipping about a girl's first recital. The teller that day, long retired, long since passed, had asked him whose name to put on it, and he had spelled it out slowly, letter by letter, as though dictating something sacred. He had told no one, not his accountant, not his lawyer, not the woman he would later marry a second time and lose before either of them grew old in that marriage. He had simply returned, twice a year, sometimes 3 times, always with cash drawn quietly from the hall's box office proceeds before they were ever entered into the books the family would later fight over, and always with the same instruction: no statements mailed, no notice sent, nothing that could be found by accident. In the present, the woman behind the reinforced glass took the passbook, turned it over twice, and excused herself without explanation for what felt to Charlotte like the length of an entire symphony. When she returned, she was accompanied by a man in a dark suit who introduced himself only by title, not name, and asked her to sit. "This account," he said, "has been active, continuously, since it was opened." He said the date. It struck her the way a struck bell strikes, once, and then in diminishing waves. 39 years. She had not yet been born when the first deposit was made. He turned the ledger screen toward her, not out of showmanship but procedure, the way one might turn a chart toward a patient. She did not understand, at first, what she was looking at, the compounding notations, the reinvestment code, the number that sat at the bottom of the column like something too large to be spoken casually in a room with acoustic tile ceilings. She asked him to repeat it. He did, without inflection, the way men in dark suits are trained to deliver numbers that other people are trained to receive, as though their lives had not just quietly reorganized themselves around a single figure. Outside, on Lexington, a bus exhaled at the curb and pulled away, indifferent, and somewhere far uptown a hall stood dark and locked, its marquee blank, its future, though no one there yet knew it, no longer entirely in the hands of the people who believed they owned it. She did not cry. That surprised her more than the number had. She had expected some collapse, some dissolving, the kind of grief-adjacent relief she had read about in other people's stories, but instead she felt strangely still, the way the hall itself used to feel in the hour before doors opened, when the seats were empty, and the air had not yet been disturbed by anyone's breath but her own. 39 years. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. 39 years before meant a spring when her grandfather was still climbing the 2 flights to the box office himself, still counting the house by ear from the wings, still young enough that no one imagining his future would have imagined this. A man quietly redirecting proceeds, ticket by ticket, season by season, into an account that bore a name he had not yet had reason to love yet, because she had not yet been born. He had begun saving for her before she existed. The banker was saying something about signatures, about verification documents, about a secondary form that would need to be notarized before the funds could be formally released into her control, and she heard perhaps 1 word in 4, because she had gone somewhere else, a rehearsal room with a radiator that clanked twice before it caught, a hand adjusting her elbow half an inch, a voice saying, "Again, from the top, and this time, listen to yourself." He had always told her to listen to herself. She had assumed it was about the violin. Across town, though she did not yet know it, a different conversation was unfolding in a glass-walled office with a view of the park, where one cousin was explaining to another, in the clipped shorthand people use when they have stopped pretending to like each other, that the hall's operating numbers for the coming season looked fine, better than fine. Once we get the lease terms sorted with whoever's holding the original agreement. A sentence spoken with the total confidence of someone who has never once read the fine print of anything he has been handed, because he has never once needed to. The lease terms. Neither cousin knew yet what those words would come to mean. Neither knew that the original agreement, buried decades deep in filings no one had thought worth reopening, contained a clause granting an option holder rights that superseded ownership itself in matters of operation, an inheritance within the inheritance, folded so small and so quietly that it had waited, patient as everything else their grandfather had ever built, for the right hands to find it. Charlotte signed where the banker indicated. Her hand was steady. She noticed that, distantly, the way she used to notice her bow arm was steady during a difficult passage, not proof of calm, only proof of practice, of 10,000 evenings spent teaching a body not to shake when it mattered. Outside, the light had shifted toward evening. She thought of the case, waiting back at the shop, its lining still half undone, its second secret, the letter, not yet read. The bank's clock read 4:11 when the banker slid the second folder across the desk. Not the trust documents this time, but a slim manila envelope marked in a clerk's careful hand. Correspondence, retain with file. She did not open it there. She had learned, in the space of 11 days, that some things wanted a particular kind of quiet before they could be read. The same quiet her grandfather used to insist on before he would let her play a phrase back to him. Not yet, he would say, lifting one finger. Not until you can hear it before you play it. 39 years earlier, on a Tuesday in March that no ledger would ever fully explain, a man in his 50s had stood at a different bank counter. This same bank, she would learn, though the marble had been replaced twice since, and opened an account with $400 and a name that was not his own. He had not told the tellers why. He had not told his accountant, who handled the concert hall's books with the meticulous, incurious loyalty of a man paid well to ask no questions. He had simply returned, quarter after quarter, year after year, with sums that never appeared on any statement the family later fought over. Proceeds skimmed thin enough to vanish inside rounding errors, invisible unless a person knew precisely where to look and precisely how long to wait. He had known how to wait. He had spent a lifetime teaching a girl to do the same. Back in the present, in the taxi pulling away from the bank, she opened the envelope on her knee. Inside was not a letter. That one, the real one, was still folded into a case lining in Queens, patient as everything else he had built, but a single photocopied ledger page, brittle at the corners even in reproduction, dated the spring she had turned 6, a column of deposits, a margin note in blue ink, half faded. C, for the hands, not the name. She read it twice before she understood. It was not a mistake that the money had never once been listed under the family accounts. It had never been family money. It had been hers from the first entry, hidden in plain sight inside a company he owned outright, and answered to no one for, which meant, she realized with a coldness that had nothing to do with the taxi's air conditioning, that no cousin, no lawyer, no auction house appraiser had ever had the smallest legal claim to touch it, whether or not anyone ever found the case. They just hadn't known to look. The taxi crossed into Queens. As the light went the particular gray gold of early evening in October, and she thought, absurdly, of her grandfather's hands adjusting a shoulder rest, unhurried, certain. Not yet, he seemed to say again, from 39 years back. Not until you can hear it before you play it. She was starting, finally, to hear it. The apartment, when she reached it, still smelled of the paint the landlord had promised to redo 3 winters ago and never did. She did not turn on the overhead light. She sat at the small table by the window with the photocopy and the passbook side by side, and beside them, deliberately, the letter she had not yet let herself finish. 9 years old, and the Hall's back office had smelled of rosin and cold coffee. He used to let her sit under the desk while he did the books, her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the scratch of his pen. She had thought it was boring work. She understood now that boring had been the whole design of it, a column of numbers so unremarkable that no one auditing the Hall's finances would ever think to ask why a company he privately controlled showed small, regular disbursements to no listed vendor at all. She opened her laptop and typed the company's name from the ledger header into a search bar, expecting nothing, the way she expected nothing from most things lately. What came back was a single filing, decades old, a holding entity registered the same spring as the first deposit. Its listed purpose was almost comically plain: artistic preservation and instrument maintenance. No cousin's name anywhere near it, no family surname at all, in fact, except buried once, in a footnote, as organizer. She thought of the will reading, the cousin's voice, bright with contempt. At least you get to keep making noise. And felt something that was not quite triumph. It was closer to grief with the volume turned up. He had built this for 39 years under everyone's nose, in a room full of people who called his violin a hobby, and none of them had ever once asked what he did with the Hall's money when the doors were locked and the ushers gone home. Her phone buzzed. A cousin's name lit the screen, not a call, a forwarded article about the Hall's upcoming renovation permits, captioned with a single line: "Thought you'd want to see what real estate does when it's managed properly." She did not answer. She set the phone face down on the table, gently, the way she'd been taught to set down an instrument, and looked back at the passbook. The final entry was dated 6 weeks before his death. The number beside it did not look real to her, not in the lamplight of a queen's kitchen with a radiator ticking against the cold. She read it a third time, then a fourth, waiting for it to become believable, and understood, the way she understood a phrase of music before her hands ever found the notes, that whatever she did next, she could not do quietly. Not this time. Not quietly, but not recklessly either. She had spent her whole life being told that patience was the same as smallness, and she was not ready to prove them right by mistaking one for the other now. 40 years earlier, in a narrow office above the Hall's ticket booth, a younger version of the man who would become her grandfather had sat with a bank clerk on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the radiator in that room ticking too, though neither of them could have known the echo it would leave. He had opened the account with $400, a number so small it would have embarrassed the family accountant, had the family accountant ever been told. He gave no address but the Hall's, no beneficiary information but a name and a birth date belonging to a granddaughter who had not yet learned to hold a bow. The clerk had asked, routinely, whether he wanted statements mailed. He had said no, he would come in person, and for 39 years, on the second Thursday of nearly every month, he had. She did not know this yet, not the specifics, not the Tuesdays or the clerk's face, or the exact wording of the ledger note beside the first deposit. Concert proceeds, private, but she felt its shape the way she felt a fingering before she'd worked it out on the string. Someone had been faithful to her before she existed to be faithful to. At 11 that night, she called the number printed at the bottom of the passbook, the bank's after-hours line, and left a message she rehearsed twice in her head and still delivered badly, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. She gave the account number. She gave her own name. She asked plainly, what a trust like this entitled its holder to know and to do. She slept 4 hours. She dreamed, briefly, of the Hall's stage lights coming up on an empty house, and woke before the alarm with her hand already reaching for the passbook on the nightstand, as if it might have changed in the dark. In the morning, she photographed every page of the ledger with the seriousness of someone documenting a crime scene, though she was documenting the opposite, a decades-long quiet loyalty that no one had thought to commit fraud to hide, only silence. She emailed the images to no one yet. She thought of the estate lawyer's face at the reading, the practiced condolence of a man paid to be unmoved, and wondered whether he had known, whether the firm's files held some clause about the operating lease that even he had filed without reading closely. She would go there herself, not to accuse, to ask plainly the same question she'd asked the bank. What does this actually mean, I own? By the time the sun came fully up over the water tanks outside her window, she had already dressed for a conversation she had not yet been granted. 40 years earlier, a man in a gray cardigan sat across from a different lawyer in a different office, one with a rotary phone and a window unit that rattled like a trapped moth, and said, "I want it written so no one has to understand it until it matters." The young associate, new enough to still take notes by hand, asked him to clarify. He didn't. He only said the word, quietly, twice, the way some men say a prayer they don't fully believe but repeat out of habit, and signed where he was told, and left before the ink was dry enough to smear. She did not know this conversation had happened. She only knew that the law firm's brass plaque had not changed in the weeks since the reading, and that walking toward it now felt different than walking away from it had. Then, she had carried a cracked case and a bruise she couldn't name. Now she carried a folder of photographed ledger pages and a question she had rehearsed on the subway until it stopped sounding like an accusation. The receptionist recognized her. There was a flicker, not quite alarm, something adjacent to it, before the professional mask resettled. "Do you have an appointment?" She did not. She said she'd wait. She waited 50 minutes in a chair with armrests worn pale by other people's anxious hands, and thought of her grandfather waiting in this same building, decades before her, patient as a man planting a tree whose shade he'd never sit in. When the lawyer finally appeared, he looked older than the funeral had made him seem, as though grief was a slow toll that collected from the living long after the burial. "I imagine this concerns the account," he said, before she'd said a word, and something in her chest loosened at being spared the performance of surprise. "It concerns the lease," she said, "the operating lease, on the hall." He did not answer immediately. He led her instead into an office, with a window overlooking a courtyard she hadn't noticed on her first visit, dust motes turning slow in a shaft of morning light, and pulled a file so thick it had its own gravity. "There's a clause," he said finally, "that was filed separately from the will, deliberately. Your grandfather insisted on it. I did not draft it lightly, and I did not expect it to surface this soon." He looked at her the way one looks at a storm that has arrived earlier than forecast. "It concerns approval rights over any transfer or renewal of the hall's operating lease. It names a holder. It has always named a holder. Me," she said, "not a question." He didn't nod. He didn't need to. He turned the file toward her instead, the way a man turns over a card he has been holding for a very long time, and said, "You should sit down before you read the rest of it." She did not sit down. She stood with both palms flat on the desk the way she had once stood at the edge of a stage before a competition, steadying herself against wood instead of nerves, and she read. The clause was 3 paragraphs long, written in the flat, joyless language lawyers use to disguise the size of what they are saying. It granted the holder of the trust, named specifically, without ambiguity, by a birth date and a signature witnessed on a Tuesday in October 39 years ago, sole approval authority over any assignment, sublease, or renewal of the operating lease, governing the concert hall's stage, box office, and rehearsal wings. Not the building. The building belonged to her cousins, deeded plainly, argued over plainly, won plainly. But a building without the right to operate inside it was a shell with good acoustics and nothing else. He separated the bones from the skin, the lawyer said quietly, watching her read it a second time. "The Hall Trust owns the walls. Your cousins own the walls. But nothing happens on that stage. No performance licensed, no lease renewed, no tenant approved, without your signature. He built it that way on purpose. I asked him once why he didn't simply leave you the hall outright and spare everyone the arithmetic." He paused, and for the first time since she had known him, something like reluctant admiration crossed his face. He said a hall can be sold out from under a family in an afternoon. A right like this cannot be sold at all. It can only be given, and only once. Across town, she would learn this later, in fragments, from people who enjoyed telling her, Her cousins were at that same hour standing in the hall's dim lobby with a contractor and a renewal contract for the lease that ran the box office concession, the very unglamorous machinery that keeps a concert hall solvent between headline nights. The contractor had asked, almost as an afterthought, whether they'd secured the necessary sign-off from the holder of record. One cousin had laughed. The other had said, "There is no holder of record. There's just us," in the particular tone of someone who has never once had to check whether a thing they assumed was theirs actually was. The lawyer closed the file gently, the way one closes a door on a room still occupied. "They will find out within the week," he said. "The filing is a matter of public record, now that the trust has been activated. I would suggest," he added, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had drafted enough documents to know how quickly triumph curdles into something people regret saying aloud, "that you decide, before that week is over, what kind of landlord you intend to be." She thought of a cracked case, a false lining, a passbook with her name on it in ink gone brown with age. She thought of the words "given" and how much weight one small verb could carry. The week arrived the way weather arrives, first as pressure, then as certainty. On a Tuesday in late October, a courier delivered a manila envelope to the offices of a logistics firm on 6th Avenue, addressed to one cousin by his full legal name, the kind of formality reserved for subpoenas and divorce filings. He did not open it until lunch. He read it twice. Then, according to the woman who shared his floor and later could not resist repeating the story to anyone who would listen, he said nothing at all for 11 minutes, which those who knew him agreed was the longest recorded silence of his adult life. The other cousin found out differently, through her own lawyer, who called her at home on a Wednesday evening and used the phrase "operating lease encumbrance" 4 times before she understood he was telling her that the hall she had already begun quietly listing with a commercial broker was not, in the fullest sense, hers to sell. She did not gloat. She had imagined, in weaker moments over the preceding months, what it might feel like to watch them absorb it, some private theater of comeuppance she could privately attend. But when the moment came, delivered second-hand through a lawyer's careful phrasing, she found she felt mostly tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has spent a year holding her breath and only now notices she can exhale. Her grandfather's letter stayed folded in the drawer of her nightstand, unread past the second time. She was saving it, though she could not have said for what. For the reopening, perhaps, or for a night when she needed his voice more than she needed sleep. In the meantime, there were logistics of her own, a structural engineer to hire, a stage manager to interview, a decision to make about the seats, whether to keep the cracked leather of the originals or replace them with something that would last another 80 years without complaint. The lawyer called again on a Friday. "They've requested a meeting," he said. "Both of them, together." He paused, and she could hear, even over the phone, the small private amusement of a man who had drafted the very document that made this meeting necessary. "I'd imagine they want to negotiate." She looked at the case on her work table, its lining replaced now, its wood oiled, waiting only for her to decide what music would fill it first. "Tell them I'll see them at the hall," she said. Not the office, the hall. The hall smelled of sawdust and wet paint when they arrived, the scent of a building mid-transformation, unfinished in the way a wound is unfinished when the stitches are still visible. Scaffolding still clung to the east wall. A single work light burned somewhere above the stage, throwing long shadows across seats that had not yet been reupholstered, their leather split and pale, like something exposed to weather it was never meant to survive. The cousin who managed money arrived first, in a coat too heavy for the season, glancing at the exposed pipework overhead with the particular disdain of someone who had once called this building an asset and now understood it as a liability wearing a familiar name. The cousin who managed appearances arrived 7 minutes later, heels loud against the subfloor, scanning the room for cameras that were not there, for an audience that had not been invited. "You could have chosen somewhere with chairs," the first said. "There are chairs," she answered. "They're being reupholstered." Neither of them sat. She let the silence hold longer than was polite. because she had learned, slowly, that silence was a tool the way rosin was a tool, the way a bow's angle was a tool, something that, used correctly, made the other person do the work of filling it. It was the first cousin who broke. "You understand," he said, "that the lease option complicates things considerably. For us, for the building's financing, we're prepared to discuss a buyout, a generous one." "I know what it complicates," she said. "I've read the covenant 3 times. "Then you know we could make this difficult," the second cousin said. And there it was, the old register, the one from the mahogany office, thinned now by a year of losing rooms instead of gaining them. Grandfather clearly didn't think it through. This isn't what he intended. She thought of the letter in her nightstand drawer, still folded, still waiting, and did not open her mouth to defend a dead man's intentions to people who had never once asked what they were while he was alive to answer. "I think he thought it through for 39 years, she said instead. "I'm only now catching up to him." The first cousin's jaw worked, the particular motion of a man recalculating a number he had believed was fixed. The second one looked past her, at the stage, at the light fixture hanging bare and waiting for its shade, and for one unguarded second her face did something neither contempt nor cruelty could account for. Something closer, Charlotte thought, to grief for a version of the family that had never quite existed. "We'll have our attorney draft terms," the first cousin said finally, already turning toward the door, already rehearsing, she suspected, the version of this meeting he would tell at his own dinner table. She let them go without walking them out. That evening the hall was empty except for the dust motes turning in the last of the light through the tall windows, and she walked the aisles the way she used to walk them as a child, counting seats instead of steps, touching the ends of rows the way her grandfather had taught her, 2 fingers, light, as if the wood might still remember being a tree. 39 years ago, a man in this same building had sat at a desk in the office upstairs with a bank passbook and a pen, and made a decision no one had asked him to make. She thought of him then, not the version in the casket, waxen and unfamiliar, but the version who used to stand in the wings during Thursday rehearsals with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the second violins as if they were the only thing that mattered in the world. He had never told her what he was building. He had only ever shown her, one lesson at a time, that patience outlasted appetite. The luthier called the following Tuesday to say the case was finished, the new lining cut and fitted, the old cracked leather cleaned and reinforced rather than replaced, because she had insisted on that. The crack was hers now, a part of the object's history she refused to erase. He had asked, almost shyly, whether she planned to keep playing it in public or simply keep it, the way people sometimes kept things too precious to use. "I'm going to play it here," she told him, "on this stage. Once it's ready." There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a craftsman recalculating what he had made. "Then I did my job properly," he said, and hung up before she could thank him. The contractors came the following week to hang the light fixture, and she stood beneath the empty socket while they worked, remembering the diagram unrolled across her grandfather's desk decades earlier, remembering being 6 years old and asking why the shade had to be that particular amber, and remembering his answer, unhurried, as if the question deserved a lifetime to consider. "Because everything under this roof should look like it's remembering something," he had said, "not just lit." She had not understood him then. She thought, now, standing under the bare bulb with sawdust settling on her shoulders, that she finally did, that the hall itself had been built to hold memory the way the case had been built to hold a secret, both waiting, both patient, both trusting that someone would eventually care enough to look inside. The passbook sat in the drawer beside the letter, both still unopened to anyone but her, and she found she was no longer in any hurry to explain either of them to the world. 40 years earlier, on a Tuesday in March that meant nothing to anyone but him, her grandfather had stood in the same building with a different set of contractors and told them the same thing about the amber shade, and the man he told it to had laughed and said it was an odd thing to care about for a light nobody would ever look at directly. Her grandfather had only shrugged and said that most of the important things in a life were things nobody looked at directly. She had not been born yet. She would not hear the story until she was 12, and even then only in fragments, offered the way he offered everything, sideways, unhurried, as if truth needed to be smuggled in through ordinary conversation before it could be trusted. Now, decades later, the cousins were discovering the shape of that same patience, though they did not yet know its name. The attorney representing the estate's remaining obligations had called twice that week, his voice each time a shade more careful than the last. There was a clause, he explained, buried in an operating lease rider that predated even the original deed transfer, an option held privately, allowing the holder to assume control of the hall's lease terms should ownership of the building change hands without the option holder's written consent. Nobody had exercised it in 39 years because nobody had needed to. Now someone did. The cousins, informed of this in a conference room 3 blocks from where the will had first been read, reacted with the particular fury of people discovering that the joke they had made at someone else's expense had been recorded and was now being played back to them in a room full of lawyers. "This is absurd," one of them said. The same one who had once suggested Charlotte's talent belonged in a hobby box. "She got a violin case. We got the building." The attorney, to his credit, only slid the rider across the table and let the paper answer for him. Charlotte heard about the meeting secondhand, from the hall's new counsel, in a phone call she took standing in her kitchen with the kettle ticking on the stove. She did not gloat. She did not even smile, not right away. She thought instead of the amber light, the sawdust, the sound the case had made when the false bottom finally gave, soft, almost apologetic, like a door that had been waiting its whole life to be opened by the right hand. She set the phone down gently and looked toward the hallway where the case now sat, restored and closed, patient as it had always been, holding one more thing she had not yet decided how to use. The lease rider gave her 90 days to exercise the option, and she let 30 of them pass before she did anything at all, because her grandfather had taught her that patience was not the absence of action, but its preparation. She spent those 30 days the way she had spent the months before, reading his letter until she could recite it, walking past the hall on her way to nowhere in particular, standing across 57th Street in the cold with her coat collar up, watching the marquee lights that still bore her cousin's hastily chosen name for the venue, a name that meant nothing to anyone who had ever loved the building. 40 years earlier, on a Tuesday in March, her grandfather had walked into a different bank with a different manager and opened an account with $400 and no explanation beyond a birth date and a name. She thought of that Tuesday often now, the specific ordinariness of it, a man in a gray coat doing something quiet that would not matter to anyone for 4 decades. She thought of the compounding, invisible and patient, working while he sat in the dark of his own hall listening to other people's music, saying nothing to the family who assumed his silence meant he had nothing left to give. She called the attorney on the 31st day and told him to prepare the paperwork. The cousins were notified by certified mail, which she understood was its own kind of mercy, sparing them the indignity of hearing it from her directly. She pictured the envelope arriving at the office they had fought so hard to keep, pictured the particular quality of silence that follows bad news delivered on good stationery. She did not go to see their faces. She had learned, somewhere in the months of rent envelopes and cold apartments and her grandfather's steady handwriting, that vindication witnessed too closely curdles into something smaller than itself. Instead, she went to the hall itself, let herself in through the stage door with a key the new counsel had cut for her that same week, and stood alone in the wings where she had stood as a child holding her grandfather's coat while he counted the house. The seats were empty, the chandelier was dark, dust moved in the single shaft of light coming through the loading door, and she thought, not for the first time, that some rooms remember who has loved them, the way violins remember the hands that have played them. She set the case on the piano bench and opened it, slowly, the way she had learned to open everything now, expecting, beneath the ordinary, one more thing waiting to be found. The violin was where she had left it, nested in velvet gone thin as onion skin, and beside it the passbook and the letter, already read a dozen times, their creases soft now from folding. She did not need to read them again. She had memorized the numbers the way she had once memorized fingerings, automatically, in the muscle, past the point of conscious recall. What she needed, standing in that dust-shot wing, was simply to hold the instrument where he had held it. 39 years of Tuesdays compressed into one afternoon of standing still. Her phone had buzzed twice that morning. She had not answered. The first call, she would learn later, came from the elder cousin, whose voice on the message was careful in a way it had never been careful with her before. The carefulness of a man recalculating, mid-sentence, everything he had assumed about the shape of his own life. "We should discuss the lease terms," he said, and left it there, as though the sentence itself were an apology he could not quite complete. The second call was from the younger cousin, who left no message at all. She had learned, in the weeks since the letter, that silence from him meant more than his words ever had. 40 years earlier, in a version of this room with different carpet and a working chandelier, her grandfather had stood at this same piano bench and told a girl of 11 that a hall was only wood and plaster until someone made it remember something. "You don't own a room by holding the deed to it," he'd said, tuning her E-string by ear, unhurried. "You own it by what you leave inside the walls." She had not understood him then. She had written the sentence down anyway, in a school notebook, because he had said it slowly, the way he said things he meant to be kept. Now the walls held peeling guilt and 40 years of unpaid attention, and the deed, she understood at last, had never been the point. The option buried in the trust gave her the lease, yes, gave her the standing to reopen the doors under whatever name she chose. But the letter had given her something the lawyers had no language for, permission to come back, not as an heir settling a score, but as the one person left who remembered what the room was for. She lifted the violin to her shoulder. The bow found the string before her mind had finished deciding. Outside, on 57th Street, workmen were already unloading scaffolding for the marquee, and no one letters the same name a room has carried, unless they intend, this time, to make certain it stays. The note, tacked to the marquee scaffolding, read, "Bellwether Hall." And the letters were not new. They were the old brass ones, cleaned, rehung in the order they had always been in, before a cousin's lawyer had them taken down and sold for scrap value nobody bothered to collect. She had insisted on that, not a rebrand, a restoration. The reopening was small, by design, 200 seats filled instead of 800, a string quartet, and then, alone, her. No press release, no mention, anywhere in the program, of trusts or leases, or the letter that had sat folded in a false-bottomed case for 39 years. That part was hers, and she meant to keep it that way. The cousins had learned of the option quietly, through their own lawyer, in a room with no rain against the windows and no crowd to perform for. Just a man in a gray suit explaining, in the flattest language he owned, that the hall they had inherited could not operate without the very lease their grandfather's trust now controlled. There had been no cutting line for that meeting, no audience to cut it in front of. Just a long silence, and then the sound of a folder closing. She had not gloated. She had signed the extension herself, at market rate, generous by any lawyer's measure, and had gone home to a kitchen in Queens that she was, at last, not counting the cost of. Now she stood in the wings, listening to the tuning fade to nothing, and walked out under the same lights that had once caught dust motes over an empty stage, while an old man sat in the third row with his eyes closed, counting nothing but her breathing. She did not think of trust documents. She thought of rosin dust on a Tuesday evening, and a voice correcting her wrist angle without once raising itself. She played his piece first, the one he had never let anyone print, the one he used to hum half a bar ahead of her, as if he already knew where she'd land. Afterward, when the seats had emptied and the ushers had gone home and the marquee light outside had been the only sound holding the street, she sat alone on the edge of the stage with the case open beside her and took out the letter one more time, not to learn anything new from it. She knew every line by now, but because some things are meant to be read aloud only once, and to no one but the person who earned the right to hear them. You don't own a room by holding the deed to it, she said quietly to the empty seats. You own it by what you leave inside the walls. Then she closed the case and turned off the lights herself.